I gotta move up here, but now it is nice. Now I can talk like this. And everyone can hear me. I'm just kidding, I'm still gonna yell. All right, so only one, right? We want to return true if only one of these things are true. So truthy, excuse me. We have to check the truthiness. So how can we check the truthiness? What is truthiness? Somebody tell me what truthiness is. Yeah.
It's if a value would be true if it were converted to Boolean.
True. Truth. All right? If you coerce a value into a Boolean, you get that value's truthiness. Whether it be false or true, it is either truthy or falsy, right? So a really quick way to convert something into a Boolean is to make sure is bang bang val1, right? Bang bang val1 will give us the reflected truthiness of val1. Is there a way to shut the lights? Do you guys want the lights off, or is this fine?
It's fine.
Okay, cool. So we need to make sure that at least one of these is true, right? So let's make sure that val1 is true first, okay? If val1 is true, that means that these two have to be falsy, right? So that means this statement will have to be true, right? We need bang bang val1, so that means that this has to be truthful, but then bang val2. A single bang means reverse truthiness. So that means this is false. That is true, okay? Oh, and I forgot the bang in front of val3. And then bang val3. That means that one of these things is truthy, and the other two should be falsy. Does everyone understand that? Yeah.
So the first one is true, the second and third one false.
Yes. If this were to be correct, only one is true, right? If val2 is true, bang val2 would be false. So then this if statement would not pass. Do you understand? So if this is that, then we return true. Then, on lazy, we do the same thing again, except now we'll check val2. Not val1, not val2, not val3. Then we can do the same thing again by checking the final value. And then if we make it past these three and nothing works, we just return false. We made it through, we made our checks. If the first one is true, but the others, maybe there's another true in here. The second one is true, maybe there's another true in here. The third one's true, maybe there's another true in here. These don't run, so we just return false. It must not be what we're looking for. Okay? So if this, or this, or this, right? So what if I just did if this, wrap this in parentheses, or that, or that. And I deleted that. That is the same thing, okay? I am chaining these together. Parentheses means we do everything inside the parentheses first, just like math, right? In math, if there's 3 plus 5 in parentheses, you do that first before you subtract it or multiply it to anything else. Same logic here. This, however, is ridiculous. Why would you write this? Why would you want to confuse anybody? This is confusing and no one can read this, okay? So sometimes it makes more sense if you are working with somebody else to do it the other way, because that is more clear. You clearly have 3 if statements, so you are clearly checking for 3 things. Yeah, this is fancy and short, 2 lines, 3 lines instead of 8 or whatever. However, it isn't really clear what I'm checking. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Two questions. Is there any benefit of doing the bang bang val 1 instead of just val 1?
No.
And then second, if you put an else at the end before return false, would that change anything?
Else at the end?
Yeah.
Like,
You just do else return false.
it doesn't change anything. I chose to do 3 if statements the first time, and then just at the end return false. However, you can do if, else, else, right? Or if, else, right? Because it's linear, so we go one step at a time. If you want 3 ifs in a row, because we're checking for 3 separate things, right? And in each if statement, there is a return statement. So we will never hit another if we are hitting one of them, right? Well, if we are hitting the first one, we won't hit another one. If we get to the second one and we go inside of it, we will never hit the third one. Does that make sense? So you actually don't need, he's right, you actually don't need to do the bang bang. You just need to write val 3, right? Because the AND operator compares the truthiness, right? It will return the first falsy value or the last truthy value. Does that make sense? It's like, why put if bang bang true if you could just put if true, right? Why put if bang bang string of apples if you could just do if string of apples? It's just converts it into a Boolean, so it doesn't really matter. And we're in an if statement, so the thing that is going to be returned will be coerced into a Boolean regardless. Yeah.
Then when would you ever need to use it?
Because bang bang is explicitly saying that whatever this is will be true or false. It's more explicit, it's more direct for what I'm doing. You know what I mean? It's more clear, in my opinion. Yeah.
So just to understand the order of operations, is it true that when you use the AND operator or the OR operator, it does whatever is, like, if you were using a statement of parentheses, it does whatever is within the parentheses or whatever's between the ands, and then it forces it to a Boolean, and then it evaluates it?
So
Is it that order?
no, so basically, so this is what's going on here. We have 3 sets of parentheses, right? And then we have 2 ORs. So this is a giant string of ORs. That's what it is. We don't know what's in the parentheses yet, right? But we see this parenthesis, and we have to see what is going on inside of it. Let's say that val 1 is true, and these 2 are false, right? So we will get true from this. So val 1 and bang val 2. That means that this returns bang val 2. Bang val 2 should be true. Bang coerces it into a Boolean, right? If this was false, it would return the value. Like if it was null, it would return the value. The AND and OR operators return the value, not the coerced value.
So
Okay.
it evaluates its Boolean value, but it doesn't coerce it into.
Yes, it evaluates its truthiness, and it returns the first falsy thing it finds or the last truthy thing. The thing that is coerced, the thing that does the coercing, is the if statement.
Oh, so anything in the
So yeah, right. So the ands and ors, yeah, sure. There's a bunch of and ors in here. At the end of the day, one value is going to be returned from that statement. One value, okay. Whatever it is, if will coerce it into a Boolean.
And that happens at the end, right?
Yeah.
So for the if it is true that everything in the parentheses is evaluated,
Yes.
then it's
Yes. Zero dark 30? Zero dark 30. All right, cool. Can everyone see? Everyone can see the text? Cool. So zero dark 30 takes what? Okay, so this takes, I'll just say none, right? So what zero dark 30 wants to do is, let's say we have 1001.01. We want to return 11.1. We want to it inputs a number, and we want to remove every 0 from that number. This is impossible to do if you don't coerce this. Well, I don't want to say impossible, but it is very probably difficult to do, I think, without coercing this number into a string. Okay? Does everybody see that? Because logically speaking, we would have to loop through this number. But you cannot loop through a number. A number is a single value, whereas strings have indexes, so you can access each character, right? So I have to make this a string first. However, the first thing I want to do is handle a very explicit edge case. Usually when someone's saying like, yeah, but if it's an empty string, return false immediately. Do that at the top, in my opinion. Because then you save your program time. You don't have to go through and read a bunch of lines of code. You just hit that if statement, return that thing, and then you leave that block at the top, and then the bottom will be the rest of your logic, right? So that first thing we do is if num is 0, we can just return n, a, n. Whoa, what about my curly braces? This is actually shorthand. If you, inside of an if statement, if you are writing something that is one line, if there is only one line inside the if statement, you can omit the curly braces and put it here. Looks kind of nice, right? Right? Cool. So, now, we can say that num is now going to be equal to empty string plus num. I am reassigning the argument because the argument is captured inside of this parameter, right? This is just a variable. Num is just a variable, right? So I can reassign that. It's not a constant, it's like a let, all right? I can reassign its value. And I'm saying it is now equal to an empty string plus itself. And if you remember, empty string plus anything is a very quick way to just coerce something into a string, okay? Now, what we want to do is if we have this over here, we're going to want to loop through each thing and somehow delete the zeros. But wouldn't it be easier to just take everything that isn't the string 0 and put it into a new string, right? So, we can have let result string equal an empty string. And now we can do a for loop, right? Let I equals 0, I is less than, what is it, num.length, I plus plus. We loop through the beginning and we go until the end because we have to check every single character if it is a 0. So if num of I is not equal to string 0, we can do result, I'll do it here, result string, plus equals num of I. If num of I is not a 0, is not the string 0, result string plus equals num of I. And remember, num isn't really a num anymore. Num is a string, okay? Coerced. So, now, result string should have everything that wasn't a 0. So we could just return plus num. So if we do 0 dark 30 of 1 this of 1, and I will console.log this, because you remember, oh shit, if you remember, if you put a plus in front of a string value that would evaluate to an actual number, where it is legal for that thing to be coerced into a number, that is shorthand, right? That is the same thing. That is coercing. So if we do that, we get, oh, no, result string. Always. I always do that. 1, 1, 0.1. Ooh, yeah.
Can you do the longhand of what plus result string is doing?
This?
Yeah, like what?
Like here,
No, but like when you put a plus in front of a string, why coerce that?
that's just what it does.
Oh,
That's just shorthand. I don't know the reason behind it, but some deeper thing in the language, I guess. I mean, the plus is just an operator, right? But since there's nothing to the left of it, but to the right of it is just a string, I guess maybe there's something weird going on. But that's just shorthand for just coercing that thing into a number. Like if I down here, if I did console.log plus hello, we get not a number, right? Because that's just not a number. It's just shorthand. It's the same thing as type coercion, as the number pass it up. Any questions on Zero Dark 30? Not too bad, right? Not too bad as I explained it to you, right? Yeah.
In the for loop, why is this less than num.length and not num.length minus 1?
Because this is the num, right? So we make that a string so it has length now, right? So the length will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay? The length is 7. What index is this last num at, though? 6. So when I is 6, we access that 1, right? If it was minus 1 and I was 6, 6 is less than num.length minus 1. 6 is less than 6. That's not true. So we wouldn't run that code, and we would never hit that last 1. Likewise, if we did less than or equal to num.length, that means that the I would actually get to the 7. But there is no index 7 here. Index 7 of that string would be undefined. Accessing this string at index 1200 is undefined. It doesn't exist, okay?
Can I do less than equal to num.length minus 1?
Yes.
Okay, it would give me the same result.
Yeah, it's the same thing, right? Because then you're including the last thing, right? Any further questions? And we'll talk about scope. Scope. All right, cool. Cool. How you guys feeling so far? It's all right, guys.
I do have one question with that.
Yeah, what's up?
That previous example. Can we use an array method once we coerce the number into a string?
Array methods are for arrays.
So when you coerce that number into a string and we're going through,
Guys, wait.
so when you're coercing a number into a string and you're using that for loop to go through each of the index of
Of the string?
the string, so the characters are not stored into an array.
No. The characters are a part of a string.
Okay.
You know? They are primitive values. They're just they're just like a value, you know? Strings, that's just how strings are made up. They're just made up of indexes, and at each index is a character value.
Okay. I had a misconception between, I guess, like.
Strings and arrays are different. You can play with them very similarly, right?
Yeah,
Like you
that's
can
what I
loop
was
through arrays as well. You guys will learn about arrays tomorrow.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, array methods are not string methods. String methods are not array methods.
Okay.
Some of them you can use for both. Like .slice is an array method and a string method.
I see.
There's just some things like that. All right. Index of you could use for both. Anyway, because there's both indexes. Anyway, so now let me see what I have to teach you guys right now. I have to teach you guys about scope. Okay. So what is scope? I'm going to tell you straight up that scope is basically when you can access a variable at a certain point in your code, at a certain place in your code. And there are pretty much three kinds of scope: global scope, functional scope, or sometimes local scope, and then also block scope, okay? So, what does that even mean though, right? What am I saying? What does that mean? Take this for example, take this whole page. Right now, there's no code on it, there's just a bunch of comments, right? Take this whole page, right? This is the outermost scope, okay? This is the outermost layer. There is nowhere to go above this. So I can just do let x equal x, and down here, I can console.log x, and I get x, right? If I made a function, and I said log it, and here, and we put this console.log in there, and I ran log it, we still get x. X is in the global scope. X is accessible in every single line of code that is written on this page because it is in the highest most scope, okay? Now, what if I put x in here, I defined it inside of a function, and then I tried to, after I define this function, right, I tried to console.log this value x. I'm going to call it value because x is stupid. All right? Whoa. Value is not defined. Why does that happen? I defined value right here. Also, if you see these three dots, REPL's cool. If you hover over it, TypeScript, value is declared, but its value is never read. What does this mean? This is because that I defined this variable inside of a function. That means that that variable is available to its own function scope, its own local scope, okay? At the global level, you cannot go down into scope. Likewise, if I had another function in here, let's say this, this was back in here, and then I had another function, test, test, and I console log the value here, right? You can write functions inside functions. And then at the end here, I invoke test. We get the x again, right? However, if this console log was out here, but this value was defined inside of test, we get the same reference error. But they're both in local scope, right? They're both in function scope. However, each function has its own scope. And this function test was defined inside of the local scope of login. And then let value is defined inside of test, right? But this function logit is trying to console log a value that was declared inside of test. No. When talking about scope, when talking about accessing values, you can only look upwards. You cannot look down, okay? Test can look at the scope of logit, and test can look at the scope of the window, the global scope. Logit can look at its own scope, not inside test. It cannot dive into test and look at the variables declared in there. That is what I mean by scope. You might have noticed this already when you were working on some problems, because this is applied to everything, okay? This is just something that you need to be aware of, okay? It'll save you guys trouble if you know that you cannot access variables down below, but you can up above. That's why when I saw some of you working on your problems, and you were trying to write a function, but then you defined your counter outside of that function, that counter was accessible by every function call, and that counter was never being reset. So At the end, it would just be a giant number, and you would have no idea why. It's because it was in the global scope, so every function can access that. And it can just change, and it was never reset. Right? Any questions? Is anyone confused?
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
Where would you put line 42 in this block if I want it to run successfully?
Well, what do you, in here?
Yeah.
You want to call the function within itself? That's recursion. You can do that. But like, we don't want to do that right now.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure. We don't want to do that right now, okay? This is running successfully. This is running successfully. The logit is running. But this console log is throwing an error. Because logit is trying to console.log. Here, let me, like, you see how these are all in line? They're at the same level, right? So this function was defined inside of logit, but then we console.log value, okay? Value is defined inside of test. There's no way we can do that. Because console.log is inside of the logit scope, right? We're inside of this function scope. But value is defined inside of test. So this is going to try and go down into there. No, you can't do that. What happens? What is actually happening is when we run logit, the function runs, right? So we go here, here. Okay, we are defining another function test. Nothing happens. It is just a function definition, right? So then we go and we hit line 39. So JavaScript is like console.log value. What is value? I don't know what value is. We have to find out. What it does is it looks at its own scope for a definition of value. But it doesn't find one, right? Where is value defined? Down below in test. It's not in the logit scope. So it looks for it there. It doesn't find it, so it looks up. It does. It looks to the global scope. If this was out here, this would work fine. Because, and let's put the console log in test. So when we call logit, we define this function, and then we call test, right? Test is this function, so let's run this function. All this function does is console.log value. So JavaScript is saying, what is value? We look inside the test scope. It's not there. So we look up one. We look into logit's value. Logit scope. We look for something called value. We don't find this anywhere, right? So we look up one more, and we've hit the global scope. It has to be here, or it's going to throw an error. Okay? And look, we found it. It's up here. Yeah?
Does it have to be up in the global scope, or can it also be down?
It has to be
It
up.
has to be up.
Like I said before, we were console logging out here, right? And this value, my God, this value was defined in here, right? When we console log, we are currently in logit scope. We can't look down into test scope. Yeah.
But up is in like the direction of the global scope. So once you hit the global scope, does it have to be above the function, or can it also be below the function?
So this is an interesting topic, and this is called hoisting. Let me explain hoisting very carefully. I can't really show it to you in REPL because REPL has some things with the let keyword. However, I can show it to you with var really quickly. Don't use var ever. But I'm just saying, I'll just show it to you really quickly. So let's say I just have var example equals this is an example, right? But I console.log example here. I get undefined. I don't get an error. This is because of something called hoisting, okay? Hoisting means that before the code starts executing, right? JavaScript actually runs through the entire page, looks at all the variable declarations, and puts them in memory. And all of those things automatically get a value of undefined. Then when we read our code, we assign them values. Does that make sense? Like, if value was down here, right? If it was down here, we would get undefined, right? Was that what you were talking about? Like the order of like the line? Yeah. So that's what would happen, right? However, there is something else I need to tell you about hoisting. So, ignore that for a second. Let's go back to this. What if I did this? And I'll put value over here. Well, I'll put value inside here, and I'll put the console log inside here. I'll fix my tabs a little bit. Nice and clear, right? So I'm nice and clear, right? So I'm calling logit, but logit is defined down here, right? Will I get an error? No, I don't. Everything runs as normal. But I just said that things are defined before they're defined. When they're hoisted, they get put into memory and are assigned a value that's undefined, right? So I should be trying to invoke undefined here, right? No, that does not happen with functions. Functions are special. The function keyword is special, okay? That means that during hoisting, the entire code of the function also gets put into memory immediately during hoisting, okay? However, if I did this, always, this is not hoisted because I am saying I'm declaring a variable, a regular variable. We don't use the function keyword, and that is the main difference between the function keyword and defining functions with this. Okay? Does that make sense?
Sorry, could you do that again? I just didn't write all of that.
If we don't use the function keyword during hoisting, all we are doing here is declaring a variable logit, right? So when you declare variables during hoisting, they get put into memory, but their value is undefined. JavaScript doesn't care that this is a function. We don't care because the const thing says the const keyword is declaring a variable, right? The function keyword is very special. It means we're declaring a function. So the entire function's code also gets put into memory immediately.
So in practice, you have to put this kind of function before you use it?
Yes.
And a function
Best
anywhere?
Best practice, you should always do that with everything, honestly. Otherwise, you will just confuse yourself, and what's the point? Like, what is the point of doing this? Like, why? You know? Maybe for like helper functions, you know? You put the helper functions at the bottom and then you call them later in your code, or something like that, you know? Maybe. But really, like, what's the point, you know? This is just confusing, okay? But it is a thing that exists, and I need you guys to know about it. All right? Yeah.
So if you started with var, then it hoists the names of the variables but not their values.
Yes.
And if you start with the function, it hoists the names and the values.
Of the function. The function's code. Yeah.
And const hoists nothing.
Hmm?
Const doesn't hoist anything.
Well, const will be the same thing as var. So in REPL, you can't do this with let or const. But because it will throw a reference error. It will just say you can't do that. Okay? However, if you were like in VS Code and you're building an application and you do that, hoisting does happen. because that's just what happens, you know? That is a REPL specific thing, I think. So, really quick, what happens if I did that what am I going to see in the console? Think hard. What am I going to see in the console? What am I going to see? What I'm going to see is, will it be this? Why? This is confusing. Why is that? It's because if you remember what I said, what is happening in this function, right? We call log it, we declare value. Let me just tab it over to be neat. We declare value, we declare a function, and then we run that function. And we pass in a string, okay? Test is now running with this argument being passed into it. Console.log value. JavaScript says, what is value? I have to find out what is value. What is the value of value? So what test does is it looks at its own scope first. And what do we find in its own scope? A parameter called value. So we read this, and this is impossible to be read at that point, because I called them the same thing, okay? If I changed this to value, I would get X, right? But if I change it back to value, oh geez, what am I doing? Oh, I put it there. We look at its own scope first, so we will never actually reach line 35. We won't be looking that high, because we found what we're looking for. We only look up a scope if we don't find what we're looking for in our own scope. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So will it be this is the value because that is permanent, right?
What do you mean permanent? In the sense of what?
It's that sense of like, because you,
Is this not permanent?
that is permanent. So,
Yeah.
so you like just invoking it, so the log it doesn't count
Hmm?
them? It reads from top to bottom, right?
Yeah, it reads from top to bottom. But like, what is happening? Like, what will happen if I pass in nothing? What am I going to get? Undefined. Not X. Because this is still a declared variable. And if you don't pass anything into a function, those variables are equal to undefined. So we get undefined thing. What is happening is that we say console.log value, we are only looking in this function scope first for something, for a variable declared value, right? And that's right here. If that wasn't there, and we don't find it anywhere, we have to look up a scope into logit scope. And logit scope has this stuff in it. So we have value there. Make sense? Everything has scope that has code blocks. The last kind of scope is block scope, okay? Block scope is pretty much the same thing as function scope with a little bit of differences, okay? So when I say a block, I mean an if statement. If true, so if we run this code, if true, so this will run, right? So we declare test, and it's a string. Then when we leave, we console.log that variable test. but it's not going to work because of block scope. The console.log is in the global scope, so we look for test in the global scope, and there is nothing higher than the global scope. We've reached the sky, right? So we can't, that's it, there must be an error, right? We cannot look down into scope. We cannot look down into this if block. We can't look down into that function if it wasn't commented out. We can't look down into anything. In the global scope, we can only look in the global scope. However, if this was like this, then this is fine, right? Because we can look up. However, this is why I tell people not to use var. var ignores block scope. Okay? var ignores block scope. Like, even though I define this value here, I can do this. And it's false. I can change values that most people wouldn't want to be changed, right? You don't, why would you want to change a lower level value from an upper scope, right? But var ignores that rule. Let takes care of that. Let is more direct. Because you would never really want to do this, right? If this was ever to happen, it is probably an accident. Probably. That is just something I need everyone to be aware of. Yeah.
So if you change that var to let, the console would throw an error?
Yes. Oh, well this is different. Because I think like you don't like if I could do like I could do like I think REPL does that for you, and most things do that for you. Like it omits the let, you don't actually need it sometimes, but it never do that. Okay.
Sorry, the REPL is ignoring the let keyword.
Yeah, it knows that you're trying to declare a variable anyway. Never do this though, ever. Okay. But that's why I was like, oh yeah, this is gonna throw an error. But no, this just declared a global variable up here. Test, right? This would be like this. It's not what we're doing. But yeah, if we do this and we try to console log in here, then we get not defined. But if we get var, we get test, right? And we get false. Should we do some slides? Yeah.
Does var ignore any like local scope or just block scope?
Just block scope, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Local scope is a little different, like with functions. Local scope is just with functions, not with ifs or while loops or for loops, right?
That's the only three block scope that we have, if while for.
Switch?
Yeah, I guess so. Anything with a code block. You don't know about switch yet, right? Yeah, it's fine.
Is it safe to say anything with curly braces?
Well, like, I don't want to say anything with curly braces, right? Because this is an object, which we'll talk about next week, okay? But, like, this isn't a code block. This is, like, if you do, like, console.log, this is an object, right? Okay? But whatever, that's not for right now. Yeah, that's pretty much the scope of today's lesson. So, does anybody have any last? I'm going to talk about all. This is more conceptual, obviously, but you do see how this is going to be used in like every function you solve, right? It's just a thing that exists, right? So it's important that you're aware of how it works deep down. When you figure out how things work deep down, you can use them in more efficient ways to solve harder problems. Okay? So, let me go through the slides. And we will go over all of this again, all right? I lost some time, so I'll do this quickly. So yeah, we're going to do what is scope, types of scope, functions and hoisting, and scope best practices, right? So scope refers to which variables can be accessed by your code at a specific location in your code. So let wow equals string wow, console.log wow, we get wow, right? That's because they're in the same scope, is that we can do this, okay? So global scope, even though a global variable can be referenced from anywhere in your code, the value assigned to the variable cannot be accessed until after the assignment operation occurs. Right? Console log wait for it, let wait for it, here I am. Console log wait for it. Undefined, hush. No, I know it's there, but it's just like, whatever. Undefined, and here I am, right? It is undefined because of hoisting. However, if you did this in REPL with the let keyword, it will be a reference error, just so everyone knows, okay? So functional scope, variables declared inside of a function are locally scoped. They cannot be referenced outside of that function. So here, we have function, happy function, let message equal I am so happy. Console.log message, we run happy function, it runs, we console.log message, up here, hopefully everyone can see it, I am so happy, right? We get that. But then we try to console.log message here. Message was defined inside of this function. It was defined locally inside of happy function. We are trying to console log it from the global scope. So we get a reference error. JavaScript is like, what are you talking about? What is that? I can't look into that function and know what's in there, okay? I can only look at my own scope. So we get a reference error when we console.log that. Do you have a question? All right. Yeah?
You said it one more time? Shut up.
We call happy function here, right? So we run happy function. Let message equal I am so happy. Just declaring a variable message inside of this function. Console.log message. Message is right here. So we get I am so happy. Then we finish the function so we can go to line 11, right? Line 11, console.log message. Where is message? Nowhere. It's nowhere.
All because you close it off.
There's something inside of this function, but we can't look inside of the function at this point. We just know that there is a function called happy function, right? So message doesn't exist anywhere on the outer scope and the global scope, so it's a reference error. If you try to console.log something that doesn't exist, reference error.
So it needs to have like a function. It needs to be within the function.
This console log has to be in the function to get this value, for sure. What if a variable is defined locally and globally? So, what are we going to get? What will we see in the console? Think globally or act locally? Act locally. Good job. Good job. Because JavaScript says, all right, what is message? I'm going to look at my own scope first, says this function. Message is defined, oh, we found something. It is in our local scope. We don't have to look out anymore. We don't have to look up. We have our value, so we'll just console log it. Act locally. Okay? Any questions?
But if console.log message is outside the function, then it would bring back the global.
Because we can't go inside there.
Okay.
You can only go outside. You can't go inside. Only outside. Okay? So if this console.log was on line 11 instead of line 9, we would get think globally, right? Because we can't look into the scope of log a message. Awesome. Oh, I just said this, right? So here, console.log message, where is message? All I see here is a variable called MSG, right? So this is act locally, but we don't care. JavaScript is still looking. We look throughout this. So we go up one, right? So now we get think globally. Does that make sense? These are just strict rules. These are all rules, okay? Rules that need to be remembered. Yeah.
Would that change anything that we put instead of function? Sorry, constant.
No, it wouldn't change a single thing. Not a single thing. Yeah.
If you have more than 2 layers, and it looks locally first, will it go to the next outer layer?
Yes. 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 It's like stairs, right? Like a step. It goes once at a time, one at a time. It will never just skip to the global scope if it's a function within a function within a function. Sorry, not function within a function. If it's a function and you have a for loop and then an if statement in that for loop, right? If the if statement is trying to access something, it's going to look at its own block scope first. Then it's going to look in the for loop's block scope. Then it's going to look in the function scope. Then it's going to look in the global scope. It will not. The if statement will never just look at the global scope if there's something else defined along the way, right? It's one step at a time. Logical, right? No funny business. No shenanigans. Any questions? Parameters are also locally scoped, okay? So you might think that this would log out. However, the parameter is here, and it's called message. We don't have to look to the global scope because we found what we're looking for already in the parameter, okay? And since we pass in act locally, we get act locally in the top. Right? I showed you guys an example of this, right? So, before we see what is going on in the console, I will run through this function and let's see what happens, right? We call outer down here. This is just, so we define let global var as global, and then we define a function called outer. Then we call outer. So let's run outer. Let's see what happens. Okay, outer, we have let outer var equal outer. Then we have another function definition called inner, and then we run inner. So let's run inner, right? Let inner var equal inner. Console.log global var. What is global var? We don't know. Let's look at our own scope. Is there anything called global var? No. So we're going to look into this scope, into this function scope, one step up. Outer var. Is there anything called global var? No. So we're going to go look one up into the global scope. We found something. So global will be console.log here. Outer var. Stop. Do you need me to do this again, or do you understand? Okay. So in the console, we get global, outer, inner. Consider nested functions. Right. So here we have a little collision. Okay? We have let collision in here equal inner, and we're trying to console.log collision. But we have a collision here. They're the same thing. What will we see in the console? Who says outer? Who says undefined? Who says inner? Nice. Nice. You guys got it. See, this stuff is very, very logical and easy to follow if you think hard, okay? Not hard, really. But like, you look inside, you look at yourself first, then you look one level up, then the other level up, and if you don't find anything, it's an error, right? That's how it will always be. Nothing will change, okay? No funny business. My God. What is the difference between this and the last one? Right, so now we don't have anything that is passed into inner. So we can still access that collision variable here because it's defined as a parameter when we define outer. And we pass outer to here, so we'll get outer in the console. Because there is no more collision with another variable called collision inside of inner. Right? Make sense? Cool. And then there is nothing besides that top collision, let collision equal global. So we look in here, nothing called collision. We look in outer, nothing called collision. We'll look at the global scope, found it, and that's what we get in the console, global. The inner function can access the scope of the outer function, but the opposite is not true. You cannot look down. Console.log inner val. We cannot look at this from here. We cannot go down into another scope. We can only look up. And there is nothing called inner var defined in the function outer or in the global scope. So that's why we get a reference error. Does that make sense to everybody?
Can you just repeat it one more time, please?
So it's the same thing as before, right? The same function we were just looking at. But now we're console.logging inner var down here after we call inner, right? So we'll see outer and inner in the console up top because here we're console logging outer var and inner var, right? So we get that. Then we can move to line 11 and we console.log inner var. But we can't look at this value because it is in inner scope, and this is in outer scope. Outer cannot look into inner. Inner can only look upwards at outer, but outer can't look in, right? So we look for something called inner var. Here, no. Here, no. We ignore what's inside of the function. Is the function called inner var? No, it's called inner, so that's not it. So we look outside of outer, and it's not there either, so we get a reference error. You were trying to console log something that is not defined. Cool? Good?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
Line 14, you're just calling the function.
Line 14, I am just invoking outer. Declares this, defines that, calls inner, declares this, console.log logs that, done running, calls console.log, reference error. Never finishes the function because of the reference error. 1, 2, 3. Done. The inner function still looks for a local declaration of the variable name before looking at the next level of scope. So here we are console.logging outer var, and we find it here, but we didn't pass anything into inner. That means that if you don't pass an argument into a function that expects one, inside of that function, that parameter will just be equal to undefined. So that's why we get undefined up there. JavaScript doesn't care about that. It just knows that this variable is declared here, so it's inside of its own scope. So that's what will be console logged. Right? Any block of code inside of curly brackets, creates its own scope too. If true, let block equal Jenny from the console.log block, console.log block, Jenny from the block. Reference error. This has access to this, but this does not. We cannot look inside of the if statement, okay, from the outer scope. Because this is the if statement scope. This is its own block scope. Okay? Does everyone understand this? Nice. The pre-ES6 var keyword ignores block scope. I showed you this as well. And this is why var is not used anymore, right? Well, I don't know if that's why, but like a lot of tricky things with var, okay? Don't use var. Don't use var. Don't use var, okay? Use let. And when you define functions, use const, okay? Honestly, in my opinion, I use const for everything, unless I need to use let. Okay? Functions and hoistings. Functions defined with the function keyword, the function declaration, can be run on any line in the file. Will this work? Yes. Okay? Variables and function declarations are moved to the top of their scope before code execution. So any variable we declare, any function that we define, is moved to the top. We already have access to these things. They are stored in memory, okay? The variables are given values of undefined. The function's code is copied, the entire function's code, okay? That's why we can run it and we get yes there, okay? Does that make sense? Functions defined with letter const, a function expression, can only be run after the line on which they were defined. No, this will not work. Because what we are doing here is declaring a variable. So will this work at this point in time is undefined. Will this work is not a function. Will this work is not a function.
I don't have that slide.
Yeah, this is, I added these. Sorry.
Can you share that in
I-
the slide?
Uh,
Can you take a screenshot of the slide?
yes. For you guys, yeah, of course. So, let's talk about scope best practices. Functions generally should not change globally scoped variables. Don't change globally scoped variables from functions. Just don't do it, okay? Always true. This variable is supposed to always be true. Function don't mind me, always true equals false. Danger, changing global variable. Don't mind me. If always true, console.log all is well. Else throw new error, everything is broken. Okay? Just don't do it. Yes, there is something called throw. Yes, there is a keyword called do. And yes, there is a global error object. You don't need to worry about that right now. Or in this course. Okay?
So when you have like an when you're solving a problem and there's like an empty string or something, wouldn't you want it in the outermost scope? And then, let's say you run a for loop and it manipulates the empty string.
Is that the outermost scope or is that the function scope? Like, if you were making a function that adds things to an empty string, wouldn't that thing be defined inside of the function but above the for loop?
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to declare that variable in the global scope at all. Which brings me to my next point. Don't even declare global variables unless it is absolutely necessary for you to do so. Okay? Like if you have one variable that is going to be like a storage thing, like a string or an array or something, put that in the function. If other functions don't need it, then don't define it in the global scope. Okay? Oh shit. Oh god. Sorry. Sorry. The heck. Sorry. Just one more slide, okay? So avoid cluttering the global namespace with lots of variables, or really any variables if you don't need them. Functions should be declared in the global scope. Well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say shouldn't, but they usually are, right? Unless you want a very specific function that is being used in a larger function, then you would declare it in that function scope, right? But only declare variables globally if they need to be accessed globally, okay? Things that are being constantly overwritten, things that are constantly being added to, those things probably shouldn't be in the global scope. Probably, okay? I am not giving you any definite instructions, okay? Because it is up to you how you manage your page, how you manage your applications, okay? It is up to you. You have the freedom, okay? I'm just giving you common best practices that will probably save you guys a headache, all right? Things can get messy super fast. Otherwise, it's safer to declare variables and functions or blocks so you don't overwrite variables accidentally, so access the wrong variables by mistake. Both likely sources of bugs. So we talked about what scope is, global functional block scope, a little bit about hoisting, and then we talked about a little bit of best practices, okay? Any final questions before you guys take a 5-minute break and get slacked out into pairs? How's everybody feeling about scope? Not too bad, right? Today and yesterday, you just got to sit down, you got to look over the slides, you got to rethink about everything, you got to reread everything, and then things will start to stick. Start thinking about scope when you are solving past problems. Go back and solve past problems from the loop lecture, okay? Think about scope, and think about where to use AND operators and OR operators, because there's places for these things, okay? My tips for helping you guys practice if you are struggling, okay? So take a break.